Night my in-laws finally left my property, I was standing at the kitchen window holding a mug of chamomile tea I hadn't even sipped yet. I watched my mother-in-law's silver sedan back down the driveway, its headlights sweeping across the lawn I had mowed myself 3 days earlier. My father-in-law was in the passenger seat, stiff as a board, not looking back once. I took one slow sip of my tea. It had gone cold. I didn't care. I just stood there in the quiet of my own house, my house with my name on the deed, and let the silence settle around me like something I'd been waiting my whole adult life to feel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the beginning, because the ending only makes sense if you understand what came before it. I married my husband Curtis when I was 26. We met at a graduate school orientation, both of us fumbling with name tags and paper cups of bad coffee. He was quiet and kind, the type of person who held doors open, even when you were still 20 feet away. I fell in love with the version of Curtis that existed when it was just the two of us. The problem was, that version barely survived contact with his family. His mother's name is Lorraine. I will describe her once and then you'll understand everything. She is the kind of woman who brings a casserole to your house and then spends 45 minutes telling you how she would have made it differently. She has a comment for every choice you make, delivered in a tone so sweet it takes you a second to realize what just happened. His father, Gerald. Wait. I was told not to use that name. His father. I'll call him the Colonel, because that's the energy he carries, even though the closest he's ever been to a military base is watching a History Channel documentary. He's the kind of man who believes the house runs on his authority, even when he isn't in the house. Curtis had one sibling, his older brother. I'll call him what he always reminded me of, a golden retriever someone forgot to train. Loud, affectionate toward the people who fed him, completely indifferent to anyone else. His wife was worse. She had the specific talent of asking questions that were actually accusations. "Oh, you're still renting?" she'd say to me at the beginning, long before we bought our place. "Wow, I just think it's so brave to not feel the pressure to settle down." She smiled after every single one. I want to be clear, I tried with these people. For 3 years of dating and 2 years of marriage, I tried. I learned my mother-in-law's recipes and complimented her cooking even when the chicken was dry. I sat through the Colonel's long speeches about what my generation was doing wrong with money. I laughed at my brother-in-law's jokes, even when they were aimed at me. I tried. What I didn't understand back then was that trying harder was never going to change the dynamic, because the dynamic wasn't about effort. It was about the role they had already decided I would play. I was the outsider, the one who didn't belong. And once a family like that decides that about you, there is no behavior on your part that changes the verdict. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. My parents were not wealthy. My father worked at a distribution warehouse for 22 years, and my mother was a teacher's aide. We were comfortable in the way that means you always had what you needed, but never what you wanted. I got through college on scholarships and worked 2 jobs through graduate school. I didn't have connections or a family name that meant anything to anyone in any room. What I had was a business degree, a stubborn work ethic, and a habit of saving every dollar I could. My mother-in-law noticed that I had grown up without money the way some people notice a faint smell. She never said it directly, but it was always there, hovering just beneath the surface of every conversation. Curtis was used to a certain lifestyle. We always did holidays a particular way. His ex-girlfriend's family had a place up in Vermont. It was just lovely. I filed those comments away and kept smiling. What I was doing while I was smiling without telling anyone was building something. I had started a small e-commerce business in my final year of grad school. Health and wellness products, mostly supplements and skincare, things I had researched obsessively because I dealt with chronic inflammation myself and couldn't afford the specialist appointments I needed. I knew the market. I knew what was missing. I started with $800 and a folding table in our second bedroom. Curtis knew, vaguely. He was supportive the way someone is supportive of a hobby they don't take seriously. He'd ask occasionally how the little shop was going, and I'd give him a real answer, numbers and projections, and he'd nod and then change the subject to something his mother had texted him. I stopped giving the real answers after a while. I just said fine and went back to work. By the end of year 2, my little shop had cleared $340,000 in annual revenue. I had negotiated 2 wholesale contracts and was in conversations with a regional distributor. I had hired my first part-time employee, a woman named Dottie. No, wait, I used that name already. A woman I'll call my first employee, who was sharp and fast and believed in what we were building. I had not told my husband the full picture. I had not told anyone in his family anything at all. Here's the thing about keeping a secret that isn't really a secret, it's just information you haven't offered up yet. I wasn't hiding my work, I was protecting it. There's a difference, and I understood the difference even if I couldn't have explained it at the time. I had watched my mother-in-law comment her way through every decision Curtis ever made. I had watched the Colonel dismiss ideas before they were fully sentences. I was not going to hand them my work to dissect before it was strong enough to survive the weight of their opinions. Then 2 things happened in the same month. The first, a private equity firm reached out through my distributor contact. They had been tracking our growth. They wanted to talk acquisition. The number they opened with made my hands shake when I read the email. I forwarded it to my business attorney. Yes, I had a business attorney. I had quietly hired one 6 months earlier and told her to schedule the call. The second, my mother-in-law called Curtis to tell him that his brother and sister-in-law needed a place to stay. They had sold their house, she explained, because they were in between things, a phrase that I later learned meant his brother had lost his job and they had burned through their savings in about 8 months. She asked if they could stay with us. Temporarily. Curtis said yes without asking me first. I want to pause here for a second because I know what you might be thinking. Why did you let that happen? And I've asked myself that question probably 1,000 times. The honest answer is that I had been trained very gradually over 5 years of being in that family to shrink, to accommodate, to decide that keeping the peace was worth more than holding the line. I was so focused on building my business in secret that I had let my actual marriage quietly tilt in the wrong direction without noticing. They moved in on a Tuesday. 6 suitcases, 2 dogs, and a coffee maker my brother-in-law immediately installed in our kitchen like he was setting up a base camp. His wife rearranged my pantry in the first 48 hours. She said she was just organizing it. She threw away a jar of tahini I had bought 2 weeks ago because she said she didn't recognize it. I said nothing. What I was doing instead was sitting in the parking garage of my office building, which they also did not know existed, on the phone with my attorney and the acquisition team. We were 3 weeks into negotiations. The number had gone up. I was holding all of this in my chest like a held breath, just waiting. The day it closed, I sat in my car for a long time before I drove home. I want to tell you I cried from joy. I didn't. I felt something quieter than that, a specific kind of still that comes when something you work toward for so long finally becomes real. I texted my first employee, who had been with me through the negotiations and would be transitioning with the company. Then I sat in the silence of my car and thought about the folding table in the second bedroom, the $800, the countless nights I had worked after everyone else in the house was asleep. And then I drove home. My brother-in-law was on our couch watching television when I walked in. His wife was in my kitchen making something that smelled aggressively of garlic. Curtis was in the bedroom on a phone call with his mother. I set my keys on the counter, went to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water, and looked at myself in the mirror for a minute. Then I went and sat down and watched television with my brother-in-law and did not say a single word about what had just happened. I had agreed with my attorney to wait 2 weeks before making any public announcement. The acquisition paperwork would go through several rounds of signatures, and the money would move in stages. I needed those 2 weeks to figure out what I was actually going to do next, not just with the business, but with my life. The problem is that money is almost impossible to keep secret in the digital age, especially when you have a business that sells products online, has press coverage I had never shown my husband, and just completed an acquisition large enough to show up in trade publications. My sister-in-law found the article first. I know it was her because she came to dinner that night with a specific kind of smile I had never seen on her face before. Not her usual performance smile. Something more calculated, like she was holding a card and deciding when to play it. She played it 3 days later. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop when she walked in, sat down across from me without being invited, and put her phone on the table, screen up. The trade publication article was open. The headline included my name and the acquisition figure. She didn't say anything for a moment. Just let me look at the screen. Then she said, Curtis doesn't know, does he? It wasn't a question. I closed my laptop. I looked at her. I said, I'm going to tell him tonight. She said, I think the family deserves to know what you've been doing. I said, excuse me? She said, this is a family unit. What affects one of us affects all of us. I sat with that sentence for about 2 seconds. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. I'm not going to tell you I was perfectly calm through what followed, because I wasn't. I had been expecting this conversation to happen on my terms. I had a plan. I was going to sit down with Curtis, alone, walk him through everything, the business, the years of work, the acquisition, and then have an honest conversation about what I needed our marriage to look like going forward. That plan dissolved the moment my sister-in-law decided to make herself the center of something that had nothing to do with her. I told Curtis that evening. We sat in our bedroom with the door closed while his brother and sister-in-law moved loudly around the kitchen on the other side of the wall. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then he said, how long? I told him. All of it, the timeline, the revenue, the negotiations, the figure. I watched his face move through several things at once. Surprise, something that might have been hurt, then something I didn't fully recognize until later, calculation. The next morning his mother called, then the colonel, then his brother sat down at the kitchen table and told me, in a voice he clearly thought was reasonable, that he had been thinking about getting back into business himself and could see a real opportunity for the two of them to partner on something. His wife nodded supportively from the doorway. I recorded all of it. I had installed a voice recording app on my phone the night before, after my attorney advised me that documentation was my best friend in the days ahead. The calls from my mother-in-law had a pattern that became clear by the second one. She wanted Curtis to have joint access to the funds for the security of the marriage. She used that phrase 4 times in one conversation. The colonel called to suggest that now would be a good time for me to invest in a family venture they had been conceptualizing. This turned out to be a vanity real estate project that had failed once already, and that they wanted to resurrect with my money as the backing. My brother-in-law pitched me every single morning for a week, a different iteration of the same idea each time, each one slightly more expensive than the last. I let them talk. I recorded everything. I consulted my attorney and my financial advisor, who I had also had for 2 years without mentioning to anyone in that house. Then I filed for legal separation. The morning I had my attorney deliver the paperwork, I also had a moving company arrive at the house with boxes. Not for my things, for theirs. I had checked with my attorney extensively. The house was in my name alone. I had purchased it 2 years before the marriage with money from my business, something I had documented carefully at the time, because my attorney had advised me to protect my assets. My husband had moved in after the wedding. He had never been on the deed. I am not going to pretend that day was clean or easy, or that I felt nothing. I had loved Curtis in the beginning. The version of him that existed before his family got their hands on our marriage, and he let them. I grieved that person. I grieved the version of my life I had imagined when I was standing at that grad school orientation holding a bad cup of coffee. But I was not willing to spend the rest of my life funding a family that had decided I was the outsider. And I was not willing to stay married to someone who had chosen, in the moment of truth, to let his family treat my work like something they were owed a piece of. My mother-in-law arrived at the house 30 minutes after the movers started. She stood in my doorway, and told me that I was tearing the family apart, that I was ungrateful, that Curtis had given up opportunities to support me. I let her finish. Then I said, I need you to leave my property. She said, excuse me? I said it again, same tone. Same words. She looked past me at the movers carrying boxes through the hallway. She looked at my face, which I had worked very hard to make completely unreadable. Then she said something about lawyers, and I said, that's a great idea. Here is my attorney's card. I had a stack of them on the entryway table specifically for this purpose. She took the card. She left. The legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. Partly because I had documented everything for 2 years without realizing that's what I was doing. Every text message that suggested I owed the family financial support, every recorded conversation about the family venture, my brother-in-law's written business proposals, which he had actually sent to me via email, which my attorney found delightful. All of it built a picture that made the separation agreement relatively uncomplicated. Curtis received a fair settlement. I was not interested in punishing him, I was interested in being done. He had a job. He had a family that would support him. He would be fine. He moved back into his parents' house, which I learned about through a mutual friend, and which felt like the most honest ending to that story I could have imagined. His brother and sister-in-law rented an apartment across town. From what I heard, it was significantly smaller than what they had been used to. The Colonel's real estate venture never found another backer. My mother-in-law, who had spent 5 years performing for a social circle that ran on the currency of appearances, found that my departure from the family and the very public nature of my business success made it difficult to maintain the narrative she had constructed. People at her church knew who I was. The trade publications had a name. She couldn't explain away the acquisition the way she might have been able to explain away a divorce if the financial facts hadn't been so visible. I heard she stopped going to her book club. I didn't feel good about that. I also didn't feel bad about it. I just noted it, the way you note something that happened outside your window while you were busy doing something else. Here is what I did instead. I took 60 days completely off. I rented a small house on the coast, just me and some books and a kitchen I could cook in without anyone rearranging my pantry. I slept 8 hours a night. I called my mother every Sunday and sat on the porch and talked to her about ordinary things, what she'd planted in the garden, what movie she'd watched, how my father's knee was doing. I let myself be someone's daughter again, without any other context attached to it. Then I came back and I got to work. The acquisition had included a 2-year consulting clause, which meant I was still involved in the brand I had built, and I used that time to develop what I was actually going to do next. I had spent a lot of hours in those 60 days by the coast, thinking about what I had really been building all along, and I realized it wasn't just a product line. It was a proof of concept that you could start with almost nothing and build something real if you were strategic and patient and willing to work in the dark for a long time before anyone noticed what you were doing. I wanted to share that. Not in an abstract way. In a practical, structural way. I used a portion of the acquisition proceeds to launch a mentorship fund specifically for women in their 20s and 30s who were building businesses while managing the kind of invisible labor, domestic, familial, emotional, that tends to go unaccounted for in traditional entrepreneurship narratives. We provided capital, yes, but more than that, we provided attorney access, financial planning resources, and a cohort model so that the women in the program were building alongside each other instead of alone. The first cohort had 12 women. I sat in on the first session and listened to each of them describe their businesses. One was building a bookkeeping service while raising 2 kids on her own. One was developing a skincare line out of her garage while working full-time at a hospital. One had a software idea she'd been too afraid to pitch to anyone because she didn't have the technical language to describe it confidently yet. I thought about myself at the folding table. The $800. All the nights. When you are pushed out of a situation that wasn't serving you. Whether that's a family, a marriage, a job, a room full of people who decided your value without asking. There is a period of time where the pushing feels like the whole story. It feels like what happened to you. And it was. But it is also, if you let it be, the first chapter of something else. I was the daughter-in-law they rolled their eyes at. The one who grew up without the right kind of money. The one who didn't fit the frame they had built for that family. Who got quietly managed out of spaces, whose work was called a little shop. Whose presence was tolerated until it became inconvenient. I was the outsider for 5 years, and I will not tell you that didn't cost me anything because it did. It cost me time and confidence and a version of my marriage that I had wanted badly to save, but here is what I know now, standing on the other side of it. The people who work hardest to make you feel like you don't belong are the people who understand, on some level, what you are capable of. They can feel it. It makes them uncomfortable in a way they can't fully articulate, so they manage it the only way they know how. By keeping you small, by framing your ambition as a personality flaw, by making you feel like you need their approval to move forward. You don't. You never did. The approvals that matter you give yourself. Over and over, every morning you choose to keep building even when nobody in your immediate world is clapping. Every decision you make from a place of clarity instead of fear. Every boundary you draw not in anger but in the quiet certainty that you know exactly what you are worth. My mother-in-law sat across from me once, this was maybe 2 years into the marriage, and told me that I was too independent for my own good, that I needed to learn how to let people in. She meant it as a criticism. She meant that I kept too much to myself, didn't share enough with the family, didn't defer to the family's way of doing things. She was right that I was independent. She was wrong about the rest of it. Being independent is not a character flaw. It is, sometimes, the thing that keeps you whole when everything around you is asking you to dissolve. Have you ever had someone in your family try to attach themselves to something you built entirely on your own? Have you ever felt the weight of people who only see your value through the lens of what you can give them? I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. And if any part of what I shared today stayed with you, please subscribe and join this community. Because the stories here are about exactly this. The long, quiet, unglamorous work of building a life that is genuinely yours, even when the people closest to you are betting you can't. I'm still building. I'll be here. And so will you. I've thought a lot about what actually causes a life to turn. Not the big dramatic moments. Not the day the wire transfer cleared or the morning I handed Lorraine my attorney's card. But the thousands of small moments that came before all of that. The nights I stayed up after everyone else in the house was asleep, working at a folding table in a second bedroom while my brother-in-law's television murmured through the wall. The mornings I smiled at a comment that was designed to make me feel small and then walked to my car and got back to work anyway. That's where it actually turned. Not at the end. At the beginning and the middle. And every unremarkable Tuesday in between. What I understand now is that people who try to diminish you are almost never doing it consciously. Lorraine didn't sit down one morning and decide to make me feel like an outsider. The Colonel didn't strategize about how to dismiss my ambitions. They operated from a framework they had built over decades. One where worth was inherited or performed or attached to a name, and I simply didn't fit that framework. So they managed me the way you manage something that doesn't fit. They minimized it, redirected it, worked around it. That's not malice. That's smallness. And smallness, when you encounter it long enough, has a way of making you question whether you're the one who's wrong. I questioned it. I want to be honest about that. There were years where I genuinely wondered if I was too independent, too private, too guarded. All the things Lorraine used to say about me in that particular tone of hers. I wondered if I was holding people at arm's length for no good reason, or if I was the problem in the room. That doubt is real, and it costs something to carry it. But doubt is only destructive when you stop moving. I kept moving. I kept moving. I kept building. And eventually what I had built became larger than the doubt. Here's what I believe about how consequences actually work, not as punishment, not as reward, but as result. Curtis made choices. To not ask. To not advocate. To let his family treat our marriage like a family asset they had a vote in. And those choices produced a result. His mother and the Colonel spent years investing in appearances and none of their energy in anything real, and that produced a result. My brother-in-law spent 8 months burning through savings with nothing to show for it, and that produced a result. I spent 4 years building something quietly and carefully, protecting it, documenting it, making decisions from a place of clarity rather than fear, and that produced a result too. None of it was fate. All of it was cause and then effect, unfolding in its own time. The intelligence I'm most proud of is not the business strategy or the acquisition negotiation. It's the intelligence that told me, years before I had language for it, that my work was worth protecting, that I did not need permission to build, that the people in my immediate world not seeing what I was capable of did not make me less capable. It made them less informed. Trusting that quiet internal knowledge, especially when everyone around you is implying you should think smaller, is one of the hardest things a person can do. It requires a kind of integrity that isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, working quietly, doubting yourself, surrounded by people who have decided your value without asking, I want you to hear this. The work is the answer. Not the confrontation, not the proving, not waiting for someone to finally see you clearly. The work. Keep building. Keep your records, know your records down to the decimal, and don't apologize for it. The results will come in their own time, and when they do, you won't need to say a word.